Welcome to Your Move with Andy Stanley. In this weekly 30-minute podcast, you'll discover how to make better decisions and live with fewer regrets. So check out our website at yourmove.is for additional ways to watch, listen, and connect. Today is the second part in the four-part series entitled Taking Responsibility for Your Life. The Archimedes principle explains the buoyancy of water. When leveraged, ships float. When ignored, they sink. The same holds true with the nature of responsibility. If we leverage it, the outcome is a gift. If we ignore it, the outcome feels like punishment. In this episode, Andy explains how to make the most of responsibility.
Now, last week we started this series on responsibility and we discovered a few things from the scripture which are pretty cool. Number one, you were created to be responsible. Okay, before there was sin in the world and before there were the 10 commandments, God gave humanity massive responsibility. The other thing we discovered, and this is basically from our experience, that we're happiest, that we're actually the happiest when we have responsibility and when we're managing it well. When you have something important to do and you're doing a good job, you just feel better about yourself, don't you? And when you don't have responsibility, or if you have it and aren't managing it well, you just kind of feel bad about you, right? Because you were created to manage and carry responsibility and to carry it well. The other thing we discovered is that in any community, whether it's a community of two people, a family, a church, an organization, a business, a nonprofit, a city, a state, a country, wherever there's a community of any size and people are taking their responsibility seriously, you don't need many rules and regulations. That essentially rules and regulations are needed when people begin to act irresponsibly. And so we've discovered at the very beginning, God created the earth and he gave humanity massive responsibility and one rule. It's amazing. And then we landed here, and this was kind of the big takeaway last week, and maybe for some of us this was the big aha, and it's obvious when I say it, but it's one of those things we don't think about much, and that's simply this, that your irresponsibility eventually becomes somebody else's responsibility. That my irresponsibility eventually becomes somebody else's responsibility. That irresponsibility isn't an isolated thing. Irresponsibility is an all skate. Irresponsibility is everybody in the pool and all swim. Irresponsibility eventually impacts other people. You're not an island. You're not a solo person. You're not the Lone Ranger. That anything you decide to be irresponsible about in your life eventually, not initially, but eventually impacts other people. So responsibility is a family affair, it's a community affair, it's a relationship affair, it's a national affair, it's an international affair. That anytime an individual or group is irresponsible, that irresponsibility eventually impacts other people, and other people have to pick up the slack and carry your weight. Now, when you were in middle school or high school, you were introduced to what was called Archimedes' principle. Archimedes' principle. Now, that probably doesn't ring a bell for most of you. You might have been in middle school, might have been high school, but all of you were sort of introduced to Archimedes. And Archimedes, a long time ago, explained why rocks sink and battleships float. You remember this? He was the rocks have been sinking and battleships have been floating for years and years and years before he ever came along. But he was the first person to explain in a formula or with a mathematical equation why it was that you could put a pebble in the ocean and the pebble would sink, and then eventually you could come along, and in his day and age it was several tons, and now several thousand tons of battleship would float. He discovered the relationship between buoyancy and gravity. And I'll put a little diagram up here for you, and I'll explain this principle. According to his principle, the buoyant force is equal to the displaced liquid. Now, you probably remember that, right? No, okay. That essentially, he's the one who discovered, this is powerful, he discovered that a weight could be supported in a liquid if the weight of the object was counterbalanced by the displacement of the water of the object. Okay, there won't be a test, so don't worry about that. Now, the point of all this is this, that things had been sinking and floating for years and years and years before he ever came along. He didn't invent this, he discovered it. Now, he was a mathematician, he was also an inventor, but Archimedes did not invent this principle, he simply discovered this principle. And people have been leveraging this principle ever since to create massive multi-thousand ton pieces of equipment and ships. They've learned how to make them float. And it's so interesting because this principle explains why a person who can't swim begins to sink. And it also explains why when the lifeguard throws a life-saving device into the water, it floats. That in the moment of saving a drowning person, this principle is at work both for the person who's drowning and the thing that's floating. It's absolutely incredible. It works both ways. This principle is not good or bad. It just is. And people can leverage it for positive things, or you can ignore it, and oftentimes there is a consequence. That's the nature of a principle. Now, I've never met anyone who thinks that God is in heaven indiscriminately deciding float, sink, float, sink, 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 float. I mean, nobody, I've never met a Christian or non-Christian or somebody from another religion that says, now God, we have created this ship and we ask that you help it to float. No, we don't think that way because we understand the principle. And if you're a Christian or you believe God created everything, if you're a theist, you believe that somehow God created these principles. And he's not in heaven making, random decisions. If you understand this principle and you adhere to it, the stuff you create will float every single time. Christian, non-Christian, atheist, if you're subscribed to Islam, it doesn't matter. This isn't a religious thing. It's just a thing. And God created a principle, and we leverage it all the time. And you can leverage it and benefit from it, or you can ignore it and pay a price. It's just a principle. Again, it doesn't reflect God's indiscriminate decisions. It's just something God has given us as a gift. And once it was discovered, we've been leveraging it ever since. Now, today, I say all that as background because today I want to talk about a different principle. This is one you've heard of before, but this is one that, again, slides off to the periphery of our thinking when it comes to decision making, and yet it's something that runs in the background of your life every single day as it runs in the background of my life every single day, as this runs in the background of our lives every single day. It's just sitting out there waiting for you to ignore it or leverage it. And this principle is one, again, you've heard before, but because there's not an immediate consequence. You see, there's an immediate consequence with this. You put something in the water that does not subscribe to this principle, and it immediately or pretty quickly sinks. It's not like you have to come back a month later and go, oh, that didn't really work out too well. You know immediately. It's like Pinocchio. He lied, his nose grew. Think I'll stop lying. If your nose grew every time you lied, you would tell the truth all the time. In fact, anytime anybody asks you a question, you'd say, okay, wait, before I say anything, I really got to think this through, okay? Because there'd be an immediate consequence. This principle doesn't work that way, so consequently, we forget it. So I'm going to put it up on the screen. Here it is. Ready? You've heard this before. Let's say that together. People reap what they sow. You've heard that before, haven't you? That's not new. But you know what? It's as true as this. And it's true every single time. Now, maybe if you grew up in a church a long, long time ago and you had like King James Bible, it went more like this. We'll put this up there too, I hope. It says like this. A person reapeth, we got it? Yeah, whatever a man soweth, that shall he also reap. Or I think it'd be better if it said reapeth. Whatever a man soweth, that shall he also reapeth. Now, here's what I want to do for the next few minutes. This is in the Bible. Now, you've heard this even if you're not like a Bible person or a Christian person, but it's actually in the Bible. It's written over 2,000 years ago in this book of the Bible we're going to look at in just a minute. And I want to read some verses that lead up to this because this is a powerful, powerful thing. And as we talk about taking responsibility for our lives, you need to understand that the reason irresponsibility eventually becomes somebody else's responsibility, and the reason irresponsibility eventually catches up with you is because of this principle. But this principle isn't good or bad, it just is. And just like Archimedes' principle, you can leverage it for good things or you can ignore it and there are going to be consequences. And it just is, and it is every single time. And if you'll listen carefully, this is going to explain to you why God's not against you, why God's not angry with you. God has given you a principle to leverage, and if you ignore it, there are consequences, and it's not God in heaven going, punish, bless, punish, bless, punish, 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 bless, punish. It doesn't work that way. That God has given us this awesome thing that we can leverage to our advantage, and it is true of all people everywhere. So if you have a Bible, I'd love for you to turn with me to Galatians, the book of Galatians, chapter 6. Galatians chapter 6. I'm going to read a few verses, and I'll give you a little bit of context. Galatians is actually a letter written to some people who lived in Galatia. Galatia was a Roman province in Asia Minor, and this was just part of that Roman world. And the Apostle Paul, this is about 35 years after Jesus left the earth. This letter was written in 60-something AD. 30-something years later, there are churches springing up all along coastlines, especially in Asia Minor. And the Apostle Paul, who planted or started this church, is writing to some Christians in Galatia, explaining a bunch of things that relates to growing as a Christian. Now, in this particular part of the letter of Galatia, let me explain what's going on. He is contrasting, and this is kind of tricky. He's contrasting two things. He's contrasting our responsibility to help other people, and he's contrasting that against the tendency on our part to allow ourselves to be helped simply because we don't want to take responsibility for our lives. It's both things. On one hand, I'm responsible to help people in need, but at the same time, I'm responsible for me. And I can't use the Christian value of, we should love one another and help each other. I can't use that as an excuse to be irresponsible. Well, I'll just be irresponsible because, if you're a good Christian, you'll come and help me with my homework. And if you're a good Christian, you'll cut me some slack. And if you're a good Christian, you wouldn't act that way even though I'm acting irresponsibly. He says, no. It doesn't work that way. You are responsible for serving other people, but serving other people and that Christian value is never an excuse for acting irresponsibly. So we're jumping in the middle of this discussion, which leads up to this big principle that whatever person reaps, that's exactly what they're going to sow. Okay, Galatians 6, verse 3. Here we go. If any of you think, again, we're jumping in the middle, so I'll try to catch us up as we go. If any of you think you are something, and he's about to say you think you're something because you're comparing yourself to other people. If any of you look around and go, well, I got it going on because she doesn't and he doesn't and I'm way ahead. If any of you think you're something, when you are nothing, you deceive yourselves. And he introduces us to this idea of self-deception, which we've talked about before. He says it's very easy to deceive yourself when you're comparing yourself to other people around you. You compare yourself to other people around you and you say, I'm so far ahead of them, I don't need to work too hard because I'm so much better than them. You compare yourself to other people and you say, well, I'm not really as good as them and I'm not really doing as well as them, but after all, they had some advantages. He says, as long as you're comparing yourself to people on either side of you, you run the risk of deceiving yourselves. Verse 4, each of you should test your own actions. Each of you should test your own actions. That is, you need to kind of draw in your focus and begin to evaluate you and your actions and your reactions against you, not against the people around you. Because as long as you compare yourself to the people around you, you're better than some and not quite as good as others. And when you compare yourself to other people around you, you will always run the risk of deceiving yourself into being irresponsible. And he's going to say that in just a minute, because I'm doing so much better than them, then I can kind of, cut myself some slack and not take these things too seriously because I'm way better than them. But at the same time, when I look at people who are doing better than me, I can say, well, yeah, but, if I was married to her, if I was married to him, or, well, if my dad owned the deal, or, if I was that talented, yeah. And so anytime we begin to compare and look around and look out the window instead of in the mirror, then it's easy for us to cut ourselves too much slack, and it's easy to just slough off and be irresponsible. Then he basically says that in his own way. Verse 4, then you can take pride or feel good. This isn't the bad kind of pride. Then, that is, if you'll quit comparing yourself to other people, then you can take pride or feel good, like we said. Then you can feel good or take pride in yourself without comparing yourself to someone else. As long as I compare myself to other people, I'll make excuses. When I begin to compare myself to myself, I'll make progress. As long as I'm comparing myself to other people, I'll make excuses. Well, yeah, I don't work as hard as I could, but look how much further along. I don't, I kind of don't take my responsibility too seriously. But what's the point? I mean, look how far ahead they are, but yeah, they have all those advantages. As long as I'm comparing myself to you or you to me, we have the opportunity to make excuses. It's only when I tune all of that out and I compare myself to me, my potential, my responsibility, the opportunities God has brought my way, that's when I begin to make progress. Then he just says it, verse 5. For each of you, that's us, should carry your own load. This is Paul's way of saying you should take responsibility for you. Each of you should carry your own load. Your own load meaning you have family responsibilities, financial responsibilities. You have opportunities that have come your way. You have things going for you that other people don't have going for them. So don't look at other people and say, well, I'm so far ahead of them. Yeah, but look what you have going for you. At the same time, don't look at other people and say, well, I'll never catch up with him because look, he says, no, you're to carry your own load. And when you look around and compare yourself to other people, the tendency is to take your eyes off the load, or the responsibility is really what that word infers in this context. The temptation is to take your eyes off the responsibility you have and to make excuses and not to make progress. But if you'll bear down, if you'll focus in on carrying your load, managing your responsibility, taking responsibility for your life, really, then you'll make progress. Then, in verse 6, we're going to skip verse 6 because he reverts back to talking about, but I'm not saying don't look out for other people. He's kind of jumping back and forth to say, this is tricky. You're responsible to extend charity to people in need, but don't use that as an excuse not to carry your own load. Then in verse 7, he bears down and he kind of gets on the on-ramp to this principle. Verse 7, do not be deceived. Now, this is the second time he said that in this discussion, because we're good at deceiving ourselves, aren't we? We deceive ourselves when we look around and compare. We make excuses instead of progress. He says, don't be deceived. God cannot be mocked. God cannot be outwitted. God cannot be outsmarted. God is not your mama. Because when you were young, you deceived and outwitted and outsmarted your mama. And so you think you can deceive and outwit and outsmart God. You called your mom and said, Mama, I didn't know there was going to be beer at that party. And I explained that to the officer, and he just arrested me anyway. So I'm down here at the play. Oh, don't you worry, honey. I'll come down there and I'll get you out. And Daddy, I don't know what happened. I think the bank made a mistake with my checking account. I got plenty of checks. I don't have any money. There's got to be some kind of mistake. Paul's going, okay, God's not that way. God can't be mocked. You may have been able to slough off your responsibility and your parents come in and fill in the gap for you. There may be environments where you've been able to be irresponsible and get by with it. He's going to look, this is a warning, it's a promise, it's an opportunity, it's an explanation, it's a lot of things. But understand, God can't be fooled. God isn't fooled by your religious system. Your irresponsibility, whether it's with your money, with your family, with your morality, with your ethics, whatever it might be, it's not a mystery to him. There's no game to play. There's nothing you can pull on him where he goes, oh, you got me again. Okay, I'm meant to watch you, young man. It just doesn't work that way. Don't be deceived. God is not mocked. And come on, whatever religious system you're raised in, we're all guilty of this. We've all mocked God. We've all treated him like we kind of found a loophole in the system. I can empty my sin bucket, your memory is erased, and I can go fill it up again and come back next weekend. I just hope I don't die on Saturday afternoon. Okay, if I'm going to die, I think the best time to die would be maybe Sunday night. The things that, okay. All right, then he kind of, okay, you with me? Okay, and listen, every religious system has some kind of silliness like this. I mean, I don't want to go too far into this because you just think I'm picking on people, but every religious system has this kind of silliness built in to where we think God's, we fooled God or we found a loophole. Paul's going, okay, I don't know who your God is. God is not mocked. Don't deceive yourself. And now he gives us this amazing, amazing principle. For God cannot be mocked or outwitted. People, that's all of us. People reap what they sow. It's a principle. It's not good or bad. It just is. Paul says what we really all know intuitively, that life is connected. That where you are today is a result of decisions you've made in the past, and where you'll be tomorrow in every area of your life is connected to what you do today and what you did yesterday. That there is a relationship between your current irresponsibility, your unwillingness to take responsibility for your life, really. There's a connection between that and what you can expect in the days and weeks and months to come. Now, let me tell you what he doesn't say. He doesn't say, don't be deceived. God is not mocked. Whatever a person sows, that's what they're going to reap unless they ask for forgiveness. See, forgiveness doesn't erase it. He doesn't say a person reaps what they sow unless they get themselves in church and start praying. And see, in my world, that's what we run into all the time. Well, Andy, I'm doing my best. I'm going, okay, that's great. You're doing your best. But see, for 5 years, you didn't do your best. See, that was sowing, now you're reaping. And doing your best now doesn't erase all the sowing. But doesn't God love me? Exactly. He loves you so much, he let you know about this principle ahead of time. See, if you're at a place in any area of your life, your finances, your money, your dating life, your relationship life, your professional life, whatever, if there's any area in your life where you're not where you think you should be and you're not where you want to be, then chances are you have sown and reaped yourself there in some capacity. Now, in some cases, it's obvious. I mean, if you have just racked up so much debt, you've saved no money, and you've given no money, and now you're going, oh my gosh, we're upside down financially. Even I could figure that out, okay? And I'm not good past adding or subtracting. Don't even give me a calculator. Most people can look at your situation and go, well, it's obviously you sowed yourself into this. There are other situations in life where it's not so obvious. So if you're somewhere in life where you don't think you ought to be, and maybe you don't even think you deserve to be, then there's a couple things you can do to leverage this principle. And the first one is this. Remember last week when I had the little pie chart up here? Oh, there it is again. Little pie chart up here. And I said this. I said, if this whole circle represents the chaos in your life, the chaos, this is a whole circle represents the chaos in your marriage, the chaos in your finances, the chaos in your dating relationship, the chaos in your school, because your grades are bad, you're about to flunk out, and you're losing the Hope Scholarship, whatever it is. If this whole circle represents the chaos in your life, then the first thing to do is to go back in your mind and ask the question, and this takes some real honesty, don't be deceived, to go back and to ask the question, okay, I don't like what's happening in my marriage. I don't like what's happening with my teenage kids. I don't like what's happening with my parents. If I'm going to begin sowing my way out of this because I don't like what I've reaped, and I'm not even sure how I reaped this, the question to ask is, what is my slice of the pie? What is my slice of the pie? Okay, I don't like what's happening between me and my kids, but I did check out emotionally. I come home, but my mind is on work all the time. So that's my slice. I don't like what's happening between me and my husband, and he works too much, and blah, 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 blah. But, okay, if I go back and I'm real honest, as soon as those kids were born, the kids took priority over my marriage. Now, I don't know that I deserve all this, but the principle of sowing and reaping is never fair, it's never just, it's never balanced, it's never proportional. So consequently, I'm just going to focus on, okay, yeah. All right, I don't think the bank was honest. I don't think the loan officer was honest, but we bought the house. We signed the paper, and nobody made us buy that house. So let's just go back to our piece of the pie. Okay, I called him back. Okay, I did agree to the relationship. Yes, I saw the red flags, but I continued to go out with her. I continued to, okay, I don't think I deserve all this. This isn't all my fault. But here's where I sowed irresponsibly. I don't know how we got into this huge financial mess, but it's true. We have misused credit cards. Now, I think the little bit of, lack of discipline around credit cards, I don't think it deserves all this, but I'm going to quit making excuses. I'm ready to make progress, and I'm going to go back and I'm going to own my piece of the pie. Now you say, well, I don't think my piece of the pie is that big. Well, your piece of the pie may be smaller, maybe that big. And if it's a marriage issue, I guarantee you think it's that big. Yeah. Paul said, look, you got to carry your own load. Your own load may be that small, but quit worrying about everybody else's responsibility and what they had going for them, and if they hadn't, and if he hadn't, if she hadn't, if the bank hadn't, if the school hadn't, if the government hadn't, if and you say, you know what, here's my part. And then the second thing you do, see, the first one, that'll take about 5 minutes if you're honest. The second one's harder. The second one is then you begin to do the things you should have been doing all along. You begin to do the things you should have been doing all along. Listen to how Paul finishes this passage. Skip on down to verse 9 if you still have your Bibles open. Galatians 6:9. Here it is. Let us not become weary in doing good. For at the proper, what's that word? Time. Don't you hate that? At the proper time, we will reap a harvest if we do not give up. You own it, and then you begin doing what you should have been doing all along. And here's where the principle of sowing and reaping works to your advantage. Just like you reap way worse than you think you deserve, do you know what I've seen? Do you know what some of the people around you have seen? That in due time, when you leverage this principle that's out there all the time for everybody, red, yellow, black and white, Christian, non-Christian, it's just out there. When you leverage this principle, that the rewards oftentimes are bigger than you deserve as well. Do you know where I've seen this the most? When couples, specifically singles too, but couples more than singles. When a couple comes in and their financial world is completely upside down and a mess, and they're thinking, how do we get into this situation? And they begin the process of steady plotting. We're going to do financially what we should have been doing all along. We're going to do financially what we should have been doing all along. We're going to do financially what we should have been doing all along. Do you know what happens so many times I can't even begin to tell you the stories? They find themselves on the upside and on the edge of that good financial wave in a way they never thought was possible, oftentimes faster and quicker than they ever thought possible. But it all begins with, okay, I'm going to quit making excuses. I'm going to quit pointing my finger. I'm going to own this. I'm going to take on my load. I'm not going to deceive myself. I'm not going to blame God. He's not my babysitter. He gave me an opportunity to leverage this or to ignore it. I ignored it for years. I'm not going to blame God. But I'm now going to begin doing what I should have been doing all along. And the Apostle Paul promises, the Scripture promises that in due time, you will. If you're 25 years old or younger, I want you to listen a second. Okay? 25 years old or younger. If you're 25 years old or younger, let me tell you what the people who are 45 years old or older are thinking. A lot of them are thinking, I wish I heard this when I was 25 years old or younger. Now, let me say something else to those of you who are 45 years old or younger. The people who are 45 years old or older, most of them did hear this in some way when they were 25 years old or younger. And they thought, and I got to tell you, years and younger, we begin to habits that follow us into 45 years old. So the question is, this is good. This is, boats float every time, bridges will hold you every time. This principle will bless you. But it will catch up with you every single day. Are you taking responsibility for your life? Are you taking this responsibility for your life, marriage, morality, all of your relationships, school, work, friendship? Are you taking responsibility for your life?
Thanks so much for listening to Your Move with Andy Stanley. We hope today's podcast will help you make better decisions and live with fewer regrets. So check out our website at yourmove.is for additional